Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about a very notorious case, an old Hollywood unsolved murder. And anybody who follows me on Twitter or Instagram or is a patron of mine will know what I'm talking about. Also, if you've been in the community tab of YouTube, you've probably guessed. We are talking about the Black Dahlia today. I am so excited to talk about this case with you guys because I've always been interested in the case, but I didn't know, like almost every case I talk about, how much went into it, how much there really was surrounding this murder. It wasn't just a cut and dry, mysterious death. There was so much more that went into it. And I'm really excited to talk about it with you today. Before we get started, I just want to show you my shirt that I'm wearing today. So I love cool shirts, and here is the one I'm wearing today. This girl runs on caffeine, horror movies, and cuss words. Pretty much me. I got this shirt from an Etsy shop called Pixel Chicks, and it's run by two women, Nikki and Crystal. I actually talked to Crystal a little bit, and she told me that her and Nikki, they had a friendship that was born out of coffee, true crime, and all things laughable, which to me is what every friendship should be born out of. So I really like this shirt. I got another shirt from them as well, so I'm excited to wear that one. And it's really important to me to support small businesses, to support independent people out there trying to make their way and create something out of nothing. And I love being able to share these shirts with you guys. So this is obviously not sponsored. They're not paying me to say this, but I will put the link to the shop in the description box. If you like this shirt, go ahead and check them out. I swear it sounds like there's an alien war going outside today. I woke up, there's snow all over the place, and I keep hearing these loud bangings and like boomings, like bombs are being dropped or something, or alien warships are landing. I don't know what's happening out there. It's like 5 in the morning. There should not be that much noise outside at 5 in the morning. Let's get started. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible has over 140,000 titles to choose from, and you can download these audiobooks to any device you have. Your iPad, your tablet, your Android or Apple phone. I listen to these audiobooks when I'm cooking, when I'm driving, when I'm falling asleep. I just downloaded the Mortal Engines book on my iPad a couple of nights ago, and I've been really enjoying listening to that for like 30 minutes before I fall asleep at night because it kind of calms me down. But Audible is so helpful when I'm researching these cases because I don't always have time to sit down and read a book, or more than one book, which was the case in this situation. I found 2 really good books that I enjoyed listening to on Audible about the Black Dahlia case. So let's get right into the video. Let's get started talking about LA's most notorious unsolved murder. I just pulled up my Google Drive where I keep my notes, and it literally only had 1 paragraph at first, and I was like, 1 paragraph? No. And I freaked out, and then it all like came back from the cloud. So let me take you back in time to Los Angeles in 1947. LA in the 1940s wasn't the same star-studded, bustling city that you will find today. It was still a sleepy movie town with filmmakers who had migrated from the Northeast to find warmer climates to shoot and produce their movies. World War II had caused an inundation of military folk to settle there. The Hollywood sign, which had originally said Hollywood Land, had also originally been meant as temporary signage for an upper-class community being developed and built in the hills. And in the 40s, this sign would become a beacon of hope for those who wanted to make it in the movie business. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Betty Bersinger and her 3-year-old daughter were walking to the cobblers to pick up a pair of shoes. As they were walking past a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue, Betty saw what she thought to be a really pale mannequin, a discarded store mannequin laying in the vacant lot. As she got closer, she realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was the body of a young woman. The woman was completely nude, laying on her back with her arms raised above her head at 45-degree angles and her legs spread. Her body was beaten and mutilated. Every square inch of flesh covered in cuts, abrasions, and cigarette burns. There were rope marks around her wrists, ankles, and neck, and her face was cut into a Glasgow smile. A Glasgow smile is essentially a wound which is made on a person's mouth by cutting the sides of their mouth up to meet their ears. Think Joker from Batman. The Glasgow smile, also known as the Chelsea grin, is a form of torture that was originated by various gangs living in the Scottish city of Glasgow. It soon became popular with criminals headquartered in Chelsea, London. It's primarily meant as a calling card or a warning to other people to say, if you mess with our gang, this is what's going to happen to you. Her body had been freshly washed. Her hair was still damp. Worst of all, she had been expertly bisected at the waist, the lower half of her body being completely separated from the top half. The lower half of her body had been positioned almost a foot away from the top half of her body, and her body was completely drained of all blood. She would become to be known as the Black Dahlia, and the origin of this nickname is highly debated. Some claim she got it from the newspapers, who excitedly covered her death in the weeks and months following it. There was a movie out at this time called The Blue Dahlia, and a lot of people claim the newspapers lazily just kind of threw black on instead of blue because her hair was dark and called her the Black Dahlia. Others say it was neighbors or locals who lived close to her, people who worked at nearby establishments, and they gave her this name because she had a penchant for wearing black, and she would often wear flowers in her hair. Either way, that is what she's most commonly referred to as today. But the Black Dahlia had a name, and it was Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, to Phoebe and Cleo Short. She was one of 5 daughters. The family wasn't in Hyde Park long, however, because shortly after Elizabeth's birth, they moved to a smaller town called Medford, Massachusetts, about an hour away from Hyde Park. Her father, Cleo Short, was a successful man. He designed and built mini golf courses. He made a pretty good amount of money doing so, but when the Great Depression reared its ugly head in 1929, he, along with so many others, would go on to lose everything. Unable to provide for his family any longer, Cleo drove his car to a bridge and abandoned it. And abandoned them. Essentially, he faked his own suicide, parking his car on the bridge so people would assume that he jumped off of it. Since so many other people were doing similar things after losing everything to the Great Depression, he didn't think it would be a hard story for people to believe, and it wasn't. They believed that he had killed himself and that he was gone. Phoebe and her daughters had to move into a smaller apartment where they struggled financially. Phoebe had to work several jobs to keep them afloat. She was a single mother raising 5 girls, and I imagine it was extremely difficult. A few years later, Cleo would write to his wife from California and explain to her what happened and say he wanted to come home. She, of course, understandably wanted nothing to do with him. She said, "We've made it on our own without you, and we will continue to. Basically, we don't need you. Thanks. No thanks." Despite growing up poor and without a father, Elizabeth Short was a beautiful and hopeful girl. Her neighbors and friends all described her as somebody who was going to go on to be something. She had thick, dark hair, beautiful blue eyes, flawless alabaster skin, and just a certain way and charm and aura about her. The Pacios lived in the Shorts' apartment building, and Elizabeth, also called Bet by the locals and her friends, she would often babysit Emma, and Emma really looked up to Elizabeth. She was beautiful. She had this presence about her. She had a sort of almost confidence that she was going to go on to achieve great things. Emma's brother, Bob Pacio, remembered Elizabeth fondly. He said she was friendly, she had a kind word for everybody. A lot of people who knew her in her youth would comment on her walk. She walked as if she was a queen, with grace and a kind of sensuality and great purpose. It was said that if she had placed a book on her head while she was walking around, the book wouldn't have fallen off. One of the people who knew her commented and said they were surprised there weren't more accidents on Salem Street when Elizabeth Short was walking down it, because the truck drivers would always stop to look at her while she was walking. She just had a way of drawing your eyes to her. Elizabeth wanted to be a movie star. She had been told so often that she had star quality and the looks to match. And the local theater was an escape from her sometimes depressing reality. She would go to the theater and watch movies for hours on end. She, her friend Eleanor, and her sister Dottie would spend hours and hours talking about the pictures that were out, the actors and actresses that were in them. They would use the front porch of the Shorts apartment building as a stage, a makeshift stage. And they would spend hours in the evenings just performing plays and movies. It reminds me a lot of the kinds of things that I used to do when I was younger with my friends, because we would always do that. We were all into Broadway musicals and plays, and we would just know these plays so well, like the back of our hand, that we could literally get up on my deck at home and we could perform these plays and musicals, to anybody who would watch. And usually there wasn't anybody watching. It was just us doing it for ourselves. So it's nice to know that even in the 1940s to, the 1990s when I was growing up, young girls do pretty much the same kinds of things. Even though Elizabeth looked and acted older than she was, inside she really was just a naive, small town girl stuck in her circumstances looking for more. And I just feel like Journey's Don't Stop Believing just started playing in my head, just a small town girl living in a lonely world, took the midnight train going anywhere. Such a great song. That's a great song. But anyways, Don't Stop Believin' could have been written for this girl, right? Stuck in small town, Great Depression era Medford, Massachusetts, watching these movies on the big screen and imagining a more glamorous life. And I'm sure a lot of us have felt that way, right? Felt we were trapped in our circumstances, that we were meant for more. We just had to find that in, and we had to take that door. Elizabeth Short had been born with respiratory issues, which had developed into asthma and bronchitis later in life. Freezing cold Massachusetts winters were hard on her, and so her mother would send her to stay in Miami, Florida with relatives every winter. She started going to Miami in the winters when she was 16, and she would work as a waitress while she was there. When she was 19 years old, she tracked her father down in California. Cleo Short was living in Vallejo, close to San Francisco, and he was working at the Mare Island Naval Station. When his daughter came to live with him, they had a rocky relationship, to say the least. I think they both expected different things out of the situation. They were basically strangers, right? He had left when she was very young. I think she was 6 or 5 at the time. And now she was 19, so they hadn't seen each other in years. He'd abandoned her and her family, so I'm sure there was resentment there. And he kind of expected when she came to live with him that she was going to be a little housewife for him, that she was going to clean his house and cook his meals and take care of him. And Elizabeth Short, who had higher aspirations than being a housewife to her absentee father, was not having that. She was a young woman who wanted to make her name as an actress. She didn't want to be a housemaid. She didn't want to be anybody's wife. And she certainly wasn't going to now come and take care of the man who had abandoned her entire family and made them struggle for years. He also didn't like how many dates she would go on. He said it was unseemly for a young woman to be seen with that many young men. She applied for a cashier job at the commissary at Camp Cook, which is today Vandenberg Air Force Base. While she was there, she was surrounded by soldiers to whom her Marilyn Monroe hourglass figure and lurid blue eyes were irresistible. They made many advances on her, even naming her Camp Cutie in the beauty contest they had at Camp Cook. But she was interested in actual commitment that would end in marriage. And most of these fellas were temporarily stationed here. They probably had girlfriends and wives back home. And they were probably just looking for a couple nights of fun. Once it got out that Elizabeth Short wasn't easy, she wasn't really treated as friendly at Camp Cook as she had been before. Things at this point had also reached a tipping point with her father. Cleo Short had finally had enough of not having a woman to cook and clean in his home. He said she would kind of go out all the time. She would come home late. He was just done. So he gave her $100, told her to go back to Medford, and sent her on her way. But she did not go back to Medford. Of course she didn't. Why would she? She went to live with a friend in Santa Barbara. I don't know who this friend is, but she went to live with a friend in Santa Barbara. And while she was here, she was arrested for underage drinking. I guess she was part of a rowdy group at a restaurant, and the police were called by the restaurant owners, who then showed up and questioned everybody, realized she was underage, and they arrested her and fingerprinted her. But the cops did end up feeling bad for her. They fell victim to her small town girl charm, and they eventually let her go. But they did put her on a bus back to Bedford. It just felt like everybody wanted this poor girl to just go back home, live a normal life, get married, have babies, do what you're supposed to do. She didn't have any plans of doing that. So she actually ended up traveling around the country at this point. She went to Chicago, she went to Florida, she went to California, she went all over the place, meeting people, making relationships, making friendships, and just kind of picking up waitress jobs as she went to stay afloat. She would spend her free time in jazz clubs. She loved the music, she loved dancing, and she especially loved the troves of young men in uniform who were lining up to take her out to dinner. During her travels, she met a young, handsome lieutenant named Gordon Fickling. He was quite handsome, quite dashing. He was a pilot. He was exactly the kind of man that Elizabeth was looking for. They made plans to get married, but unfortunately, Gordon Fickling was shipped out to go fight in World War II to Europe. Elizabeth Short once again had to change her course. She went back to Bedford for the holidays and then went back to Miami because it was the winter time, so she went to Miami and she had to stay in warmer climates. Asthma and bronchitis and things like that, they act up more in the winter. Here in Miami on New Year's Eve 1944, she met another young, handsome man in uniform. He was a major with the Flying Tigers named Matt Gordon. Now, I did some research into the Flying Tigers, and I love looking into these old cases because I'm such a big history buff, and I always find out things that I wouldn't have normally thought to look into if I hadn't been looking into the case. So the Flying Tigers were a group of volunteers from the Army, Navy, and the Marines who volunteered to go to China, where they would set up a base and hopefully compromise Japanese supply lines and advanced staging areas. There is so much more about this group, the Flying Tigers, and if you're interested, you should really go and just look up some sources and investigate it yourself, because if you like war history, and World War II is one of my favorite wars, the Civil War being a close second, if you're interested in war history, there's so much cool stuff out there that you can find. And the Flying Tigers is one of those weird, this happened in history kind of things that you might want to look into. Anyways, she gushed to her mother and sisters in letters about how much she loved Matt Gordon. They spent every spare moment together before he was shipped back to India, and he promised when he got back he would marry her. Matt Gordon wrote a letter to his mother on May 5th of 1945 asking her if she thought that Elizabeth really loved him. And she responded, "It kind of looks like she does. In 11 days, she wrote me 27 letters." While Matt was away, Elizabeth was corresponding with Matt's mother. When Elizabeth visited her family that summer, she came home wearing Matt's wings, his pilot wings, on her blouse, and she was glowing with the happiness of somebody who's newly engaged. He would write to her often and send her beautifully embroidered linens from the Philippines, which she would lovingly place into a hope chest. And a hope chest is basically a big chest, or it can be a box or anything you really want it to be, but it symbolizes an unmarried woman putting things together like linens and household items into a box that she will then use in her married life. Elizabeth was often worried about her fiancé fighting in the line of duty, but when the Japanese surrendered on August 14th, she felt like she could breathe and turn her thoughts to more positive occurrences, like her upcoming nuptials. Unfortunately, in another twist of disappointment in young Elizabeth's life, her 26-year-old fiancé would be killed in a plane crash just the day before he was supposed to return home. Elizabeth received a Western Union telegram from Matt Gordon's mother, and it said, "Matt killed in plane crash on his way home from India. My sympathy is with you. Pray it isn't so." It's a weird message, don't you think? That's kind of a weird message. Pray it isn't so. Do you know it's so? Or do you not know it's so? Elizabeth fell into a stupor after this, which is quite understandable. She would read and reread Matt's letters, crying over the love she lost and the life they had planned together that was over before it began. But life goes on, and Elizabeth was still young and beautiful, with the dream of becoming famous. And when the winter chill once again invaded Massachusetts, Elizabeth found herself back in Miami, distracting herself with an endless line of suitors. Her favorite of those were the ones who wore uniform. She was a big fan of servicemen. She loved them all, and she didn't discriminate. Army, Navy, Marines, she was here for it. Whatever money she saved from waitressing, she would put towards her wardrobe. She would never want to be caught out of the latest fashions, and she would go without eating before wearing something that wasn't in style at the time. She favored really beautiful, dark, tailored suits. She could often be found in striking black tailored suits, contrasting with feminine, soft, ruffled blouses. She liked long gloves and high heels. She hennaed her hair to make it darker. She wore dark red lipstick. She played up her features. In July of 1946, she returned to California, rekindling her relationship with Gordon Fickling. In my opinion, it was a relationship that centered around intense physical attraction and impulsive kind of jealousy and control. Gordon was always writing her letters, concerned that he wasn't the only one or even the top one in her heart, that there was other people competing for his attention and his love. And they would eventually have the same arguments so many times that they decided it was best that they just part ways. But they did remain friends. Gordon Fickling actually moved to North Carolina, where he became an airline pilot, and he would still keep in contact with Elizabeth and send her money every now and then to help her out. So he seems like a really good guy. I wish she had ended up with him after Matt Gordon died. After parting from Gordon Fickling, Elizabeth tried to make it in LA as a model, but it's not an easy industry to break into. There was a million other young, beautiful girls who were trying to break into the modeling industry, and she wasn't finding it really easy to get jobs. She moved around a lot at this time. She didn't really have the money to live anywhere permanently, so she would live someplace for like a couple weeks or a month, and when the rent was due, she would gather her stuff up and slip out the side door to move on to the next place, where she would do the same thing. One of the places she seemed to return to, though, time and time again, was the home of Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen was a Denmark native who moved to LA in 1921 and would go on to become a successful businessman. He owned several theaters and was also part owner of the nightclub called Florentine Gardens on Hollywood Boulevard. Florentine Gardens was a popular spot for the Hollywood elite and high-profile gangsters alike. And Hansen loved rubbing elbows with all of them. He only hired beautiful young girls to dance or serve tables at his club, which isn't odd at all. I get that. Sex sells. But what is odd is those young girls who were typically down on their luck, not making enough money to survive, he offered to help them so they could stay with him at his home for free. But we all know that nothing in this world is free, and I certainly promise you that nothing in Los Angeles is free. Hansen was basically a predator. He used his money, his power, and his position to take advantage of young women who were short on cash and needed help. And when they didn't have enough for the rent, which was often, he would exchange room and board for sexual favors, essentially. He was, for the most part, many of these young women's landlord and boss. And he kind of established an arrangement with them that as long as they continued to maintain a sexual relationship with him, they would have a place to work and a place to stay. He hired Elizabeth to waitress at the Florentine Gardens in 1946, and it was said that here Elizabeth Short met and befriended a young, pretty much unknown actress who had her first wedding reception at the club, named Norma Jean Baker. This actress would go on to be known as Marilyn Monroe. When Elizabeth started working at the club, Hansen quickly became infatuated with the beautiful, young, enigmatic Miss Short. Maybe more so by the fact that she would continually avoid and decline his advances. But as we know, Elizabeth Short was broke, and she eventually accepted his offer to stay at his house. She lived here with 8 other young women, and the rent was $1 a day. This would buy you essentially a place to sleep, a part of a bunk bed, obviously, and a little area of closet to store your things. And that was pretty much it. Mark Hansen would proposition Elizabeth time and time again, and allegedly she turned him down every time, which pissed him off because he saw her out with a different guy every single night. And he said she would bring back all sorts of unsavory characters to his home. The girls she lived with also said that Elizabeth was constantly seeing a different guy every night. We might be quick to judge young Elizabeth Short for her seeming loose behavior, but this was pretty common in the times. It was called dating for dinner. Most of these girls in LA had come there to make it big in Hollywood, only to find it was a cutthroat and almost unreachable business to get into. This left hundreds of young, beautiful, and charming women prowling the streets of LA trying to figure out where their next meal was going to come from. And they survived by accepting dates from men. They would be taken out to lunch, to dinner, for drinks by different men who would pay. And, if you wanted to reciprocate in return, you could, but you didn't have to. And a lot of these men who were interviewed after Elizabeth's death said they only saw her once, and once they figured out she wasn't going to put out, they didn't really call her again. Elizabeth would come and go from Mark Hansen's boarding house. She would stay there for a few weeks. They would get into an argument, or she couldn't pay and wouldn't sleep with him, so he would kick her out. But he would always take her back, and she would always come back. To me, it seems like there's more to the relationship with Mark Hansen than meets the eye. Some sources say she did have a relationship with him, that she was in love with him, but didn't like that he was seeing other women. But most of the sources that I have found reinforce the fact that she was in fact not sleeping with him, did not want to sleep with him. And I mean, he was an older man. He was in his late 50s. He was kind of short and chubby. He was actually kind of handsome in the pictures. I think he was handsome for like an older guy, but he couldn't really compete with the hundreds of men in uniform, which was her thing, who were, knocking at her door every night to take her out. If there was any attraction there at all, I believe it would have been an attraction to his money and his power and position, what he could offer her, what he could do for her. And I think she kept coming back because she had no place else to go. And she knew how Mark felt about her. And she knew if she kind of led him on a little bit, maybe she could milk a couple weeks out of him, maybe even a month before he realized she wasn't going to have sex with him, and kicked her out again. We are going to talk about Mark Hansen a little bit later, as he becomes a very important player in the aftermath of Elizabeth Short's death. Elizabeth left on a bus headed to San Diego, California on December 8th, 1946. She had told people she was going there to stay with friends, but she was found by an employee of the 24-hour Aztec movie theater sleeping in the theater. This woman was named Dorothy French, and she felt bad for Elizabeth, who told her stories about how hard it was to make it in Hollywood, how she'd run onto tough times. The Frenches told Elizabeth she was welcome to stay there for a few days while she got things sorted out, but she would be there for almost a month. They eventually had to ask her to leave. Elizabeth pretty much just laid around all day. She seemed depressed. She seemed out of it. She didn't really contribute to the household, and she spent all night out partying. But it was here in San Diego that she would meet another man, an important player in her life and her death. Robert Red Manley was a married businessman, and he had noticed Elizabeth Short standing on a street corner in San Diego one day. He pulled over and asked her if she needed a ride, and she at first ignored him. She played coy, she looked away, and he kept insisting to her that he was safe, he was a good guy, he was just trying to help, and eventually she gave in and got in his car. To me, it seems as if she might have been standing on this street corner just waiting for a man to notice her and offer her a ride. She'd been asked to leave the Frenches. She didn't have a place to stay, and she was probably looking for another dinner, possibly more. They saw each other here and there over the course of the next couple of weeks. They would spend some time together. And on the evening of January 8th, according to Red Manley, they spent the night together at a motel in San Diego. He claims there was no physical contact. There had never been any physical contact between him and Elizabeth. They had just spent time together, dated casually, and that night they spent the night together with their clothes on. The next day, the morning of January 9th, she asked him if he could drive her to LA. She was going to take a bus to Berkeley to meet her sister who lived there. He took her to the bus station and helped her check her suitcase there, and then she asked him to drop her off at the Biltmore Hotel, where she was meeting somebody. He dropped her off at the Biltmore, saw her into the lobby, and left, and this was around 6:30 p.m. that evening. Robert Red Manley is one of the last people who was known to have seen Elizabeth Short alive. The Biltmore Hotel at this time was the largest and grandest hotel west of Chicago. It was very glamorous, having seen the likes of Walt Disney, Shirley Temple, Clark Gable, Spencer Tracy, Betty Davis, Ginger Rogers, and Jimmy Stewart, to name a few. But it had its dark underbelly, mixing Hollywood glitz and glamour with organized crime, as was so common in LA for many years before Elizabeth Short walked into its grand lobby. The spacious and well-appointed presidential suite has housed 6 U.S. presidents, royalty, and notorious gangsters such as Al Capone and Bugsy Siegel, and still has a hidden recessed spot in the room to hide liquor, a nod to the days of Prohibition. During the years of Prohibition, the hotel's gold room boasted a bustling speakeasy, complete with a hidden door that would allow the stars and politicians of the day to sneak out the side entrance onto Olive Street and avoid the police. But it is a gorgeous work of art and architecture. And if you ever happen to find yourself in LA, I highly suggest you put it on like your top 5 places to see. Its inspiration was pulled from Spanish and Italian Renaissance styles, with the hotel lobby being the jewel and the crown of the Biltmore. Stepping into the lobby will make you feel like you're in a grand Spanish cathedral. It's now called the Rendezvous Court. It's 3 stories high and finished with 24-karat gold paint. But let's not forget the grand ballroom of the Biltmore, boasting 2 elaborate Austrian chandeliers that are so delicate they have to be hand dusted by the staff. And the staff have to actually climb up and hand dust these chandeliers, where typically chandeliers would be lowered down to be dusted. The staff have to climb up, which is very high, to hand dust them because they're so delicate and fragile. The domed ceiling illustrates the hand-painted artwork of Italian artist Giovanni Battista Smeraldi, the same man responsible for beautiful work done in both the White House and the Vatican. Needless to say, it was a place of great luxury and beauty. It was a place to see and be seen, and a place Elizabeth Short might have hoped to find her next meal ticket. Walking through the hotel lobby or bar, you would find yourself with a wide array of eligible men of means who were possibly traveling through and staying there for business, or maybe just meeting other important associates there. No one is sure if Elizabeth Short had been to the Biltmore before or if this was her first time. All we do know is this is the last place she was seen alive before her body was found a week later. It's said to this day that her ghost haunts the Biltmore, wandering around the 10th and 11th floors. And the Biltmore Hotel bar even serves a drink called the Black Dahlia in remembrance of her. The doorman who worked at the Biltmore at this time gave a statement that he had seen Miss Short in the lobby of the Biltmore, and it looked as if she was waiting for someone. He says he saw a dark figure wave to her through the window from outside as if they were beckoning her. This was around 10 p.m. According to the doorman, it was dark and he was unable to identify the figure who was beckoning to her. But when Elizabeth Short saw this person, she got up, she exited the Biltmore, and she walked south on Olive Street. So what happened between the evening of January 9th, when Elizabeth Short was seen at the Biltmore, and the morning of January 16th, when her broken and battered body was found in a vacant lot? This time period is often referred to as the missing week. No one saw her, allegedly, at this time. No one heard from her. There was no contact between her and anybody else. So where was she, and who was she with? We can only assume at this point that in that week's time, she was being tortured by a madman who would in the end take her life. Let's talk about the investigation. LAPD took the lead on the investigation, but did ask the FBI and the local newspapers for help. This may seem weird to you in today's day and age where the press and the police are kind of like not on the same page, and the police are always trying to keep the press out. But in order to better understand this concept, you have to understand 2 things. One, the LAPD during this time, in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, was a very corrupt agency. Although they've cleaned up their act since, some, They were pretty much known for being bought and paid for by corrupt politicians, gangsters, and criminals. The LAPD was getting payoffs basically from every direction to look the other way. The second thing you need to know is this was pretty common in the time for the LAPD and the media to work together. They had a symbiotic relationship, they helped each other, and I think a lot of that has to do with the police force being corrupt because it's very unprofessional and it almost seems counterproductive at times because you don't want the media to know everything about a case because you don't want them to report everything about a case. That way when you have a suspect and they know things you didn't report, you know you have the right person. But if the media kind of has access to the same information as the police, there's no control over what they publish. Officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald of the LAPD were first on the scene. By the time they got there, the crime scene was already swarming with the press, with the looky-loos, with the passerbyers, people just wanting to stare at the crime scene, which I don't know why, because it was absolutely gruesome. Press were already trampling around her body, taking pictures from every angle, and the police were pretty much like not happy about this. So they quickly sealed off the crime scene and pushed everybody back. The first thing they noticed was the significant lack of blood on the body and around it. They concluded because of the lack of blood that she had been killed elsewhere and then brought to this vacant lot, but it also appeared as if her body had been staged. So this wasn't just a drive-by and dump the body. This was somebody who had parked their car, gotten her body out of the car, brought it to the field, and then staged it the way they wanted it to be staged. This was somebody who wanted her to be found. And this was somebody who wanted her to be embarrassed and ashamed. They put her in a very compromising position. She had no clothes on. She was absolutely destroyed, her entire body. The police had two theories. It was either someone who knew her or someone who didn't know her. It's some great police work right there. But so here's why they thought that. They thought it would have been somebody who knew her because of the violence of the murder, that it would have to be somebody who emotionally was invested in her or was very angry with her, had strong emotions toward her in order to do that to somebody. Or they thought that it was somebody who didn't know her, who was basically just a psychopath, somebody who was crazy, who got off on these types of murders. Dew under her body signified that she'd been placed there after 2 a.m. when the temperature dropped below 38 degrees. They said her hair had been freshly hennaed and washed. It was still damp. It was also found that many of her teeth were rotted and riddled with cavities, and that she'd been melting candle wax and stuffing the cavities with the candle wax, which is something I guess that people did back in the day when they didn't have money for healthcare or dental care. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown were assigned to the case and they immediately got to work. They needed to first identify this woman because without an identification, they couldn't really investigate the crime. So they needed to get fingerprints to the FBI in Washington. What they usually did in this time was they airmailed it, and that would take about a week for the FBI to receive it and to get the results and let them know. Warren Woolard, assistant managing editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, pointed out that this would take a long time. And he offered his help. The newspaper used a sound photo machine, a precursor to the fax machine, to transfer information quickly between news outlets. Although fingerprints had never been sent this way, if it worked, it would speed up the investigation by a great deal. They agreed to try, and the first set of fingerprints was sent over to their sister paper in Washington, D.C. The first try didn't work. The fingerprints were too blurry, but Russ Lapp, one of the photographers who worked for their sister paper in Washington, D.C., he suggested blowing up the pictures of the fingerprints and tried to send them one by one. And this actually did work. As soon as the pictures came over, they were grabbed up and hand-delivered to FBI headquarters. Once the FBI received the fingerprints at 11 a.m. on January 16th, the girl was identified very quickly, and we already know that she was Elizabeth Short. Her fingerprints were on file for when she applied for her job at Camp Cook, and also on file for her underage drinking arrest in San Diego. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover made a statement saying, "The action of the Los Angeles Examiner in transmitting the FBI fingerprints of the unidentified murder victim is an excellent illustration of the cooperation of the press with law enforcement, and it is such cooperation that aids law enforcement in curbing the increase in crime." The LA Examiner's role in this was not selfless, of course. It got the scoop on all other papers in the country with the murder victim's name and her mugshot that the FBI had sent over. They ran a front-page article titled, "Girl Torture Slaying Victim Identified by Examiner FBI." The Examiner's name comes before the FBI. To the Examiner's credit, though, while other publications posted pictures of Elizabeth's face, although heavily touched up, still her face at the murder scene, the Examiner did not. They did print a picture of her body covered by a blanket in the vacant lot, but they tried to keep it respectable, I guess. The untouched versions of these photos nobody ever saw, and they wouldn't resurface until 1984. You can find them online if you are inclined to look. I will not be putting them in this video because they are gruesome. Dr. Frederick Newhart performed an autopsy on Elizabeth's body the same day she was found, January 16th. The official cause of death was determined to be hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations to the face. Some injuries to her body had been inflicted post-mortem, but most of them had happened to her when she was alive. Cleo Short, her father, was tracked down, and it turned out he was living only 3 miles away from where her body was found. He claimed he had not seen his daughter since she left his home in Vallejo in January of 1943. When they found Cleo, he was said to have been in a drunken stupor with wine bottles surrounding him. They had to pound on his door for like 10 minutes before they could wake him up. He was extremely uncooperative, saying he wanted nothing to do with this. He wanted nothing to do with her, and after she left him in 1943, he wanted nothing to do with the entire family. He refused to go to the morgue and identify her body, and he didn't even attend the funeral of the daughter he had abandoned so many years before. Cleo Short would die 20 years and 4 days after the death of his daughter. The detectives then spoke to Lieutenant Gordon Fickling, and Gordon said he had sent her $100 in December of 1946. The last time he heard from her was in a letter she had written him on January 8th, 1947. She told him she was going to be going to Chicago to pursue a career in fashion modeling. Police went to every house within a 10-mile radius and knocked on doors, seeing if there was anything suspicious going on, seeing if anybody had noticed anything, seen anything, heard anything that night. They got no leads from this. They also had the FBI send them the name of every medical student in the area. They had come to the conclusion, based on the clean bisection of Elizabeth's body, as well as some other surgical sort of things that were done to her that I will not repeat, they had come to the conclusion that the person who did this, because it was so cleanly and expertly done, had to have some medical or surgical knowledge. The names they were given from the medical school, those all panned out to be nothing as well. Police learned that Robert Red Manley was the last person to be seen with Elizabeth when she was alive. He was on a business trip with his boss, Harry Palmer, so they basically laid in wait for him to come back. And when he pulled up, the media was there, of course, because I'm sure the police let them know, and they were able to capture pictures of him being frisked and handcuffed and taken to the station for questioning. At the police station, Red Manley was given 2 polygraph exams. He was also questioned tirelessly throughout the night. They did a background check on him, and they found he had been discharged from military service for being mentally unfit. His alibi for the night of the murder was that he had been playing cards with his wife and another couple, and all 3 backed him up. They said that he was there, and his alibi panned out. The results of the lie detector tests came back inconclusive, but they couldn't hold him because they had nothing on him. Meanwhile, the media's having a field day with the murder of Elizabeth Short. Paper after paper being pushed out with her face forever connected with the name Black Dahlia. They loved the story. Beautiful small-town girl turned LA vixen, prowling Hollywood Boulevard for her next sexual conquest. They turned her into a predatory and loose woman, basically using and discarding men after she'd drained them dry. Some newspapers even falsely reported her as being a prostitute, which she was not. One of these newspapers even called Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's mother, to get private and personal information about her daughter from her. In order to do that, he told Phoebe Short that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest in LA and they needed information for her expose. And Phoebe Short was more than happy to give this information. She was happy for her daughter. Her daughter was out in LA making something of herself, just like everybody thought she would. It was only after they'd gotten all the information from Phoebe that they wanted that the reporter informed her that her daughter had been murdered. The reporter informed her, not a police officer, not in person, over the phone, by a reporter who had spent 10 to 15 minutes on the phone with her already, just getting and sucking information from her that he could use in his paper. On January 23rd, J.H. Richardson, editor of the Examiner, received a call from a man who claimed to be the Black Dahlia murderer. He called himself the Black Dahlia Avenger. He claimed he didn't like the way the newspapers were covering the story of Elizabeth Short and that he was going to be sending a package over to them soon. Sure enough, the next day a box arrived at the Examiner's offices. Inside of it were Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, social security card, personal photographs, a newspaper clipping of Matt Gordon's obituary, and an address book with about 75 names in it. On the front of the address book was embossed the name Mark Hansen. A letter was included utilizing cutout words from a newspaper, like an old-fashioned ransom note. It said, "Here is the Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." This is the only correspondence that the police and press received from people claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer that they think is actually from the Black Dahlia killer, because there would be other letters and notes and confessions that would arrive after, but they know this first package was legit because of her belongings. Also, the box and her belongings and the letter, everything was wiped down with gasoline to remove any prints that might have been on them. In the following months, the police would have 33 people confess to this murder, some of them more than once. This delayed the investigation quite a bit, as they had to look into all 33 confessions and prove that that person was not guilty while they were still trying to prove who was guilty. They also had hundreds of people stream in claiming to know her or have known her, be friends or acquaintances. A lot of these people did not have anything to do with her, but some of the people who came in did know her and gave the police some useful information. Elizabeth Short, in death, had achieved what she found so difficult in life. She was famous. Let's talk about the suspects. First, you have Robert "Red" Manley. The day before she went missing, as we already know, Elizabeth was with Red Manley. The family she was staying with in San Diego, the Frenches, saw her leave the house with her suitcase in hand, and a neighbor of the Frenches saw her get into the car of a very tall, pale, red-headed man with blue eyes, and this was Red Manley. He was very cooperative with the police, and although we know that the polygraph exams came back inconclusive, I would almost say that his intent and willingness to take a polygraph exam shows more about his innocence than the actual polygraph exam result. Because we all know polygraph results can be very unreliable and aren't a real good indicator of whether somebody is guilty or innocent. The same day that a package with her belongings was delivered to the examiner, Elizabeth's shoe and purse were found in a nearby garbage can. Robert positively identified these things as belonging to her. He said he knew they were her shoes because he had paid to have them resold for her recently, and the handbag smelled strongly of her perfume, which had lingered in his car long after she'd gotten out of it. The police also administered a dose of sodium pentothal, which is also known as truth serum, and they tried to get more information from him, which even the truth serum didn't give them anything new. I don't think Robert "Red" Manley is responsible for this at all. He was cooperative, he wanted to help, and he did drop her off at the Biltmore and left, and his alibi panned out. Red Manley had already struggled with mental illness, the main reason he was released from military service, and we would discover that after he suffered from nervous breakdowns and auditory hallucinations. In 1954, his wife had to commit him to a mental hospital, and he died of an accidental fall on January 16, 1986. 39 years after, to the day that the Black Dahlia faced her end. He was definitely a philanderer, probably not a great husband, struggled with mental illness, but I don't think he murdered her. Mark Hansen, immigrant, ladies' man, business owner, predator of young women down on their luck. There's a lot of interesting and mysterious theories about this man. Elizabeth lived on and off with him in the months before her death, and he was said to have had a thing for her, obviously being frustrated when his intentions were not reciprocated. Additionally, on January 8th, 1947, the day before Elizabeth Short went missing, she called Mark Hansen in LA while she was still in San Diego. What did she say to him on this phone call? What was said in the call, we'll never know. Mark Hansen gives all sorts of statements that contradict themselves. Did she call him and say, "I'm in San Diego, but I'm going to have someone bring me to LA tomorrow. Where can I meet you?" And he answered, "The Biltmore," a hotel that a man like Mark Hansen would have frequented. Was he the man who had pulled up and waved to her through the glass window? She seemed to be waiting for someone. She seemed to recognize the person she was meeting. Her time had run out at the Frenches. They'd asked her to leave, and she probably realized she needed another place to stay. And Mark Hansen's boarding house for young women had always been her go-to before when she'd run out of options. Had she called him and said, "I need a place to stay again?" And he'd said, "I'll pick you up." Did she decline his advances one too many times that night and he just had enough? I feel like I just asked a lot of questions, but seriously, they're questions that need to be asked. It is very possible, according to a new book published by Pew Eatwell. It's called Black Dahlia, Red Rose. She theorizes that Mark Hansen did commit the crime, but he left the dirty work to somebody else. A young man named Leslie Dillon, a former mortician's assistant and a current lackey to the mob and Mark Hansen himself. Now, Leslie Dillon was one of the prime suspects in the early days of the Black Dahlia investigation. In 1949, Dillon had sent a letter to the LAPD's chief psychiatrist, Joseph Paul DeRiver, under the pseudonym Jack Sand. He claimed he was writing to Dr. DeRiver because he had read an article in a True Detective magazine where DeRiver had spoken about the case, and he wanted to get the doctor's take on the murder, since Dillon, or Jack Sand, was interested in sadism and sexual psychopaths, and he wanted to write a book about it. Dillon and DeRiver exchanged several letters, and DeRiver began to suspect that Dillon was, in fact, the one who had killed the Black Dahlia. Leslie Dillon knew things about the murder that he shouldn't have, and he claimed that an associate of his, Jeff Connors, was the one who had done the murder. He said this man, Jeff Connors, had committed the murder in a hotel room, and DeRiver thought that Jeff Connors was a fictitious person, a figment of Leslie Dillon's imagination to kind of project the crime of what he'd done onto somebody else because he couldn't live with himself. So he planned to meet with Leslie Dillon, and he wanted to bring some undercover officers along as well for protection. They planned to meet in Las Vegas, which was neutral territory for the both of them, and DeRiver interrogated Leslie Dillon with the two plainclothed officers standing close by to intervene if they needed to. He basically told Dillon, "I think you did this," and Leslie Dillon was like, "No, it's my friend Jeff." And so DeRiver and the police officers were like, "Well, bring us back to California, show us your friend Jeff, and we'll believe that you're not guilty of this." So he's like, okay. So they go to San Francisco and they can't find this Jeff Connors character anywhere. And they detain him in a motel and question Leslie Dillon for quite a while, I think like 2 days. And they still kind of get the same responses from him. They officially took him into custody on January 9th, 1949. On January 11th, the San Francisco Police Department notified LAPD that they had in fact found Jeff Connors, who existed. His real name was Artie Lane, and Artie Lane worked as a janitor at Columbia Studios, where Elizabeth Short had been known to hang out, hoping to be discovered. Even though police could not confirm the whereabouts of Leslie Dillon between the days of January 9th and January 15th, that missing week, they assumed he must have been in San Francisco and they released him. They were really focused on Jeff Connors, or Artie Lane, whatever his name is. They were focused on him now. Police did describe Leslie Dillon as somebody unlike anybody they'd ever met before or after. He was very intelligent. He would switch moods very quickly. He would kind of read the room and see what everybody else was feeling and then kind of match his mood and his behavior to that. He wasn't stupid, to put it plainly. Mark Hansen was shown a picture of Leslie Dillon, and he did not identify him as somebody he knew or somebody who worked for him, but he did identify him as one of the rapscallions he'd seen Elizabeth bring home to his boarding house 1 or 2 times. According to Eatwell in her book, Mark Hansen told Leslie Dillon to get rid of Elizabeth. He was done with her, he was over it, to get rid of her, but he hadn't known that Leslie Dillon was basically a psychopath and had really violent, crazy tendencies. So he didn't know he was going to get rid of her in such a public spectacle of a way. The theory goes on to say that Hansen and Dillon took Elizabeth to the Astor Motel, where Leslie Dillon had lived once. While investigating his previous residences, police were told by a man named James Hurst, who lived across the street from the motel, that he had seen a woman matching Elizabeth's picture at the motel, and she had even asked him for money for bus fare, and he'd given her 50 cents. The couple who owned the Astor Motel, Henry and Clora Hoffman, told the police about a guest who had stayed at their motel a few times. They called him the man from Batavia because he had an accent and they couldn't identify it. They thought it might have been German or something. They were shown a picture of Mark Hansen, and they said they thought it looked like him, but they couldn't be sure until they saw him in person. Henry Hoffman was very concerned to be a witness in the situation, telling the police, "I hope the mob doesn't kill me after this." When police asked him why he would make a statement like that, he said, "Well, this is Mark Hansen, and he's known to be affiliated with the mob." According to the Hoffmans, cabin number 3 had been covered in blood and feces the morning of January 15th. They said they'd seen a pretty young, dark-haired girl staying here at this time the week of January 9th, and also the man from Batavia was staying there at this time as well. The Hoffmans said the girl seemed to be scared, looked as if she was always crying. There were times when they thought she appeared to be trapped there, maybe drugged up, quite out of it a lot of the time. And it had become a point of contention between Henry and his wife because she wanted the girl to leave. She thought she was trouble and there was something going on with her. She had been staying in cabin number 9. And on January 15th, there was also a packet of bloody clothes that were consistent with what Elizabeth Short would have worn, found in cabin number 9. Henry Hoffman's sister and brother-in-law, Betty Jo and Bert Mormon, were also staying at the Astor Motel around this time, and they also remember seeing the dark-haired girl as well as the man from Batavia. All 4 of these individuals were brought to observe Hansen in public and in person from afar, and they all agreed that he definitely could be the same man. Later on, during a grand jury trial of the Elizabeth Short murder, the police would re-interview these 4 people. For some reason, the interviews happened in Mark Hansen's office, with Mark Hansen present. When they were faced with Mark himself, the Hoffmans retracted their statements. But the Mormons held steady. They insisted that this could have been the same man, even after the police threatened them and said, you're going to be under perjury if you continue to lie on the stand and you go to trial with this. Like, is this really what you want to do? On August 2nd, 1949, the crime lab went to the Astor Motel and conducted chemical tests on all 10 cabins, looking for signs of blood residue. According to Chief Forensic Specialist Ray Pinker, no blood was found. In early 1949, the LA District Attorney's Office put together a grand jury of 12 people to look into the murder investigation of Elizabeth Short, as well as some other murder investigations that they felt the police had mishandled. The proceedings uncovered a staggering amount of corruption in the city's police department, even at its highest levels. But we already knew that. Now, the author of Black Dahlia, Red Rose, she theorizes that because of the corruption and because of Mark Hansen's position in the city, the police covered up his involvement as well as Leslie Dillon's involvement in the crime. I have not finished reading this book yet, but I highly suggest it. It's an entertaining read. They go into a lot of detail into the police corruption, and it's just a really good book. So you can get it on Audible and you can also buy it on Amazon. The third suspect is the most interesting to me. I could make an entire video on this man alone. Dr. George Hodel. Dr. Hodel was born in 1907. He was an only child born in LA. This man had one hell of an interesting life. Very early on, at like the age of 6 or 7, he was discovered to be a musical prodigy. He studied at the Montessori school in Rome with Madame Montessori herself. And he would play piano to auditoriums full of people at the ripe old age of 9 years old. But music was not his only gift. He was also very, very intelligent. He had an IQ of 186, 1 point higher than Einstein, which he would tell anybody who would listen. He graduated from school early and he was admitted to Caltech at the age of 14. He then went on to have an affair with one of his professor's wives, got her pregnant, and then was asked to leave Caltech because of the scandal. After this, he tried a couple different things. He became a cab driver in LA for a little bit. He then became a newspaper reporter for the LA Record. He was a crime writer. During this time, Prohibition was in full swing, and Hodel became very tight with a lot of LAPD officers because he would ride with them to the scene, like to go break up these speakeasies, knock down the door, and be able to write down the names of all the high-profile people who were inside. Because remember, the police and the press worked pretty closely together. He was also there at murder scenes when he started writing about homicides, so he would actually go with the detectives to the murder scenes and be able to, capture everything firsthand. When he was around 17 or 18, he met John Huston. John Huston would go on to become a famous director, but at this time, he was just teenage John Huston, and he and George Hodel became friends. John was dating a woman named Emilia, and George was dating a woman named Dorothy, and they would often go out together on double dates, but eventually it looked like John and Dorothy had fallen in love, and they ran away together and got married. So George and Emilia were left together and kind of fell in together, I guess, and eventually she got pregnant. They went to San Francisco, where George studied pre-med at Berkeley. After Berkeley, he went to UCSF to complete his medical training. After his son Duncan with Emilia was born, he had an affair with another woman and got her pregnant, and she gave birth to a daughter named Tamar. In 1936, he graduated and he got a job with the U.S. Health Department. He traveled around a little bit with them for a couple of years. Then he came back and he got a job with the LA Health Department, and he became a venereal disease specialist. It wasn't long before he rose up in the ranks, becoming the VD control officer for LA County. Now, in true love story fashion, George Hodel's ex-girlfriend, Dorothy, who had married his friend John Houston, she divorces John after 7 years and comes back to George. They get married and they have 3 children. At this point, George Hodel moves his family into Soden House. Soden House is a home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, which looks like a replica of a Mayan temple, just the place for the up-and-coming doctor and his family to live in. It's located on Franklin Ave. George Hodel would have many star-studded parties here, hosting the rich, the famous, and the eccentric at his one-of-a-kind home. The mystery of the house is completed with a secret room behind the bookshelves in what was once George Hodel's office. And his son Steve reports that the kids were not allowed into this room, and he's not sure what was in this room besides pornography, because his father was basically a sex deviant and a sex addict. In 1949, George Hodel is arrested for incest. His daughter Tamar, who was 14 years old at the time and had been staying with them for the summer, she had run away from home, and the police had picked her up, and because she was underage, wanted to bring her back to her father. And she insisted she was not going back there. When they asked her why, she told them that he had been basically sexually assaulting her for a while, and that he would pass her around to his friends at his parties. I guess in those days, they called sexual abuse of a minor incest. George Hodel was given a trial, and he hired the top criminal defense attorney in the country. This should have really been an open and shut case. There was 3 adult witnesses who testified to being in the room when this happened to Tamar. But George and George's family all claimed that Tamar had made it up, that she was a troubled child and she lied a lot. Well, of course, George's family are going to come to his defense, and they're going to do whatever it takes to keep the man out of jail because he's their meal ticket. He pays the bills. He's the rich doctor. And what use is he to anybody behind bars? In a startling but not really surprising turn of events at this point, the jury came back and George Hodel was acquitted. Now, here's the twist. When George Hodel was picked up for incest, he was already a main suspect in the Black Dahlia murder. When they brought him into the station to question him about the incest claims, they actually used this opportunity when he was out of the house to go into the house and plant a lot of microphones all over the place. And that is where they proceeded to listen to the private going-ons of the home of George Hodel for the next 40 days. The microphones were installed in the home on February 15th. Here are some of the interesting things the transcripts of the recordings show. On February 18th at 12:30 a.m., Hodel is talking to a woman. There's a radio playing and the woman sounds like she's crying. He asked her about someone committing suicide and if her husband knew she was there. At 1:15, the mics pick up a woman reciting poetry, and Hodel says something about an affair with Dr. Hodel before saying, "Relax, let's finish these 2." At 4:20 p.m., there is some noise around the house and a woman's voice asking for the operator several times. She's crying and clearly upset. At 7:35 p.m., Hodel is heard having a conversation with another man who has a German accent. He says, "This is the best payoff I've ever seen between law enforcement agencies. I'd like to get a connection made in the DA's office. Any imperfections will be found. They will have to be made perfect. Do not confess ever. 2 and 2 is not 4. Then there's laughter. Then, he says, we're just a couple of smart boys, aren't we? Ha ha ha." Hodel then tells the German about his trial, and he goes on to say that they're out to get him. And then he says this: "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore. She's dead." Around 7:45 p.m. that same evening, George is heard talking to the man with the German accent again. He says, "Realized there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and covered her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Call Georgia Street Receiving Hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary. At 8:20 p.m., it sounded as if two men were down in the basement and started digging. One of them said what sounded like not a trace, and it sounded as if a pipe was being hit. At 8:25 p.m., the tapes picked up a woman screaming, and 2 minutes later, at 8:27 p.m., a woman screaming again. Okay, so clearly this is creepy AF, right? The transcripts aren't perfect. There's a lot of things that they couldn't hear to transcribe, but it appears to me that George Hodel has confessed to killing his secretary, confessed to possibly killing the Black Dahlia, and maybe had a woman killed in his home that very night that they were recording him. But let's dig a little deeper. The German man that Hodel is talking to has since been identified as Baron Ernst von Haringa. They are talking about Hodel's secretary, and her name was Ruth Spalding. Ruth Spalding died of a drug overdose in May of 1945. George Hodel was present with her when she died, and he had actually burned some of her belongings before he called the police. She was brought into Georgia Street Receiving Hospital the night of her overdose and pronounced dead at 12:39 a.m. Later documents were found indicating that she was about to come forward with some very incriminating evidence against her employer. Apparently, George Hodel had been intentionally misdiagnosing patients, billing them for tests, medications, and treatments that they did not need, and she was going to basically expose him or blackmail him. Either way, he had a motive to want her dead. Now, it is possible that Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, was one of these patients. He was a very popular doctor, especially among Hollywood actors and actresses, police officers, politicians. He was like the doctor to see in Hollywood. And it's very possible that she might have seen him. And she could have been one of these patients. And that's why Ruth Spalding would have known something about Elizabeth Short. Then we have the sound of the woman in the house being questioned by George Hodel, reciting poetry, trying to call 911 several times, the sound of men going into the basement, the sound of someone telling them without a trace, the sound of what seems to be a pipe beating on something, a woman screaming twice, and then nothing. And this woman was never seen leaving the Hodel residence. Nothing about this woman was ever heard from again. She was not heard on these recordings ever again. Which seems odd to me because there's two police officers less than 5 minutes away, sitting there listening to these recordings live, and they didn't choose to do anything about it. On February 19th, George is heard on the recordings telling his friend, poet Kenneth Rexroth, that he's going to be selling his art and leaving for Asia soon. And listen, guys, there's more. There's so much more. I will link the transcripts in the description box if you're interested in checking them out. There's so much more. This guy was messed up. Right after he's acquitted, he puts his house on the market, sells his car, gets his affairs in order, and he leaves. By the fall of 1950, George Hodel has relocated to Hawaii, where he is immediately hired as a resident psychiatrist for the Territorial Hospital. He's a psychiatrist now. After 3 years in Hawaii, he moved to the Philippines, and he continued his psychiatric work there before realizing that there was a new field coming up, market research, and he jumped on there in its early days, and he actually became really successful in this field. Only thing is, during this time that George Hodel lived in the Philippines, something happened. In 1967, when George Hodel was living in Manila, a woman was murdered there, and she was left with her body bisected in two pieces. They call this the jigsaw murder. Connected or coincidence? You guys all know how I feel about coincidences. In 1990, 40 years after his hasty departure from California, George Hodel returns to the United States and settles in San Francisco with his new wife. He died at the age of 91 from heart failure, and at this point, his son Steve Hodel, who had actually worked as a detective, a homicide detective in LAPD, he came to San Francisco to his father's high-rise to collect some of his belongings. And in those belongings was a photo book. The photo book had pictures of family and George and his friends, but it also had two pictures that struck Steve Hodel as odd. The two pictures were of two women that may have been the same women, who had dark hair and dark eyes, looked very glamorous. And he asked his stepmother, who are these women? And his stepmother basically was like, I don't know who they are. You know, your father was really sexually active back in the day. So Steve Hodel thinks that these two pictures resemble the Black Dahlia, and this sends him on a several-year investigation into his father's connection with Elizabeth Short, which concludes in him believing that his father, George Hodel, murdered Elizabeth Short. He also thinks he's connected with other unsolved murders in the LA area, including the red lipstick murder, which happened only weeks after the death of the Black Dahlia. Now, Steve Hodel has written several books about this, the most well-known, I believe, being The Black Dahlia Avenger. It's an excellent read. You should pick it up if you're interested in this kind of thing, especially if you're interested in George Hodel, which who wouldn't be interested in George Hodel? Because the guy's like an enigma wrapped in an enigma shoved into a crazy ass fortune cookie, and there's just so much there to discover about him. The more I read into it, the more interested I become. And he does have a lot of support from others who believe this theory is solid, including head deputy DA Stephen Kay, who considers the murder solved. He also has many opponents to this theory, like some of his old buddies in the LAPD. Detective Brian Carr of the LAPD, who was in charge of the Black Dahlia investigation when Steve Hodel brought it back into the light, he says that Steve doesn't have enough to prove that George Hodel was involved with this murder at all. He says the evidence is weak. The transcripts are taken out of context. And basically that if Steve Hodel and Stephen Kay brought this to trial, they would be laughed at. Detective Carr says there is nothing to be found. Maybe so. Or maybe the fact that George Hodel was allowed to walk after raping his 14-year-old daughter, after implicating himself in 2 murders on tape, and possibly committing a 3rd murder on tape. Maybe that makes the LAPD look bad. Possibly this is the department's dirty little secret kept locked away from a time when they played it fast and loose, worked for gangsters instead of the public, and swore an oath to protect and serve their own interests. See, the original tapes and the recordings from George Hodel's home, they've been lost, along with quite a lot of other evidence from the Black Dahlia case. The other evidence that hasn't been lost is basically kept under lock and key, with only one person, known as the gatekeeper, having access to that filing cabinet. No one knows what happened to this lost evidence. It's just been lost. I gotta tell you, it's hard to believe that the evidence was just lost. Police officers are trained very well. They know how to take care of evidence, and typically evidence doesn't go missing. Typically evidence in a high-profile case such as this doesn't just go missing, especially important evidence that would implicate somebody they didn't want implicated. No one knows what happened to this evidence, but allegedly it was lost. And when I say allegedly, I mean conveniently. What are they trying to hide? What could be so important and so secretive that an unsolved murder from the 1940s would still be so kept under wraps in 2019? What is it that they don't want us to know? Brian Carr doesn't think that this case will ever be solved, and I tend to agree with him. With so much mystery and intrigue surrounding this young woman, with so many theories and possible suspects still popping out of the woodwork today, and with what appears to be an enormous and damaging secret the LAPD wants to keep hidden, this case will never be solved. Because I believe if it had been handled properly from the start, it would have already been solved. To me, the most plausible suspects out of all the many, because there's many, I didn't talk about all the suspects, but Hansen and Hodel seem to be the most plausible to me. And that's why I highly suggest, if you're interested in this topic, to read the book about the Hansen theory, which is called The Black Dahlia Red Rose by Pew Eatwell, and then also to read Steve Hodel's book about his father, George Hodel, being the Black Dahlia murderer. This young lady, Elizabeth Short, she kind of got a bad hand dealt, right? I mean, she's abandoned by her father. She and her siblings and her mother are alone, and they have to make it in a time when it wasn't easy to be alone as a woman. And she sees for herself and dreams for herself that even though the world's a dark and ugly place where bad things happen to good people, she can still make it, and she can be something. She can get away from this person she was that was just a little girl lost, abandoned by her dad, grow up poor. She can transform herself into somebody else, kind of like Marilyn Monroe did, right? And she still held that dream, and she chased that dream. She chased a dream of stardom. She chased a dream of true love. She chased a dream of a good life that she wanted to be happy in. And somehow along the way, she came across somebody who didn't want that for her. She came across somebody who wanted to hurt her in the worst way possible. And if you look into this case, this woman was tortured and horrible things were done to her in the days before her death. It is thought that she was kept alive and tortured for almost the entire week that she was missing. She wasn't a prostitute. She wasn't a slut. She didn't sleep with everybody. There's a myth going around saying that her sex organs weren't fully developed, so she couldn't even have sex, and that's not true. According to the autopsy, her sex organs were completely normal, but there is this huge myth that's running rampant on the internet, and a lot of people actually believe it. It's not true. She was fine in that area. But she also wanted a real relationship. She wanted a marriage. She wanted the real deal. And what she was doing was, she was using men for dinner. She was dating them and giving them her company in exchange for a meal so she could survive. It doesn't make her a bad person, and it doesn't make her a slut, because all of these men, when talked to by the police, said she wouldn't put out. She wasn't that kind of girl. And when they discovered that, they dropped her. So really, if anybody's bad in this situation, it's the guys who bought her dinner only because they thought that they were going to sleep with her. So, I mean, she was a normal girl just trying to make her way through life. She had horrible, horrendous things happen to her. But I'm always going to remember her as Elizabeth Short. I'm always going to try and remember her as the stunningly beautiful young woman who had such an interesting and attractive walk that at least 5 or 6 people, when they were interviewed about her, brought it up. I mean, that's amazing. You're a gorgeous woman. You have a lot of traits. I mean, her body was amazing. She had curves in all the right places. She had beautiful lips. She had beautiful eyes. Her skin was flawless. And yet, people remembered her walk. You're that impactful as a presence that you're gorgeous and you're talented and you have an amazing personality, but people remember your walk. Wow. That's amazing. This video is going to be going up on Monday, January 15th, which will be the anniversary of her death. I know she was found on January 16th, but I do believe that she obviously probably died on the 15th. So let's all just go watch an old black and white movie, Marilyn Monroe, Clark Gable, hell, throw on Gone with the Wind, because that was one of her favorites. Let's watch that, let's remember her, and let's try to be safe out there, because there's some seriously messed up people out in the world. Okay guys, that's gonna be it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this Black Dahlia video, which turned more into a conspiracy theory cover-up video rather than a Mystery Monday. I know there's so much more information to this case that I didn't put in here. The Man Ray paintings, if you're interested, look into George Hodel's friend who was an artist named Man Ray, and he actually made 2 paintings, and Steve Hodel thinks that these 2 paintings were almost made as like trophies to Elizabeth Short. And the one, which is called the Minotaur, oh my god, it's so crazy creepy. And then there's another one that's like red lips with the lips like stretched out, and Steve Hodel says that Man Ray, who was like their family photographer and was always around and was George Hodel's like best friend, he was in on all the crazy stuff that George was doing. And these pictures were basically pictures that were trophies to Elizabeth Short's death so that George Hodel could remember. But if you guys have any other interesting facts, throw them in there. Maybe I don't know about it, and I would love to hear. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Stay kind and stay beautiful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
My girl is the kind of girl that keeps me satisfied. She keeps me satisfied, oh yeah.